Dark Side of the Ring this week covered deathmatch legend Atsushi Onita and FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, the company that he founded in 1989 that really was the hardcore inspiration for ECW several years later. And I said during my review of the Nick Gage episode earlier in the season, I personally am not a big deathmatch guy, so I don't hold Onita up as this revered figure like a lot of people do, but his influence is still felt to this very day. And I love that they got Terry Funk for this episode. There was a lot of concern for Terry this summer, and reports that he was in an assisted living facility and he was having memory issues. I don't know when this interview was done, but it had to have been within the past year. It was great to see him on there, and Mick Foley, who worked for Onita, who has the reputation as the king of the deathmatch. Chris Jericho, who's been pulling double duty as the narrator and a talking head on a lot of these episodes. He also worked for Onita. They interviewed Sabu, and they spoke to the man himself. I thought the episode was a good primer for someone who had no idea coming into it what FMW even was, or who Onita was. I thought it gave you a good overview of what he was about and what the promotion was about. Onita was a young high flyer on the rise. And in one of the This Week in History segments I did a few months ago, I covered the Tupelo concession stand brawl that Onita was part of when he came to work in the States. In 1979, Jerry Lawler was part of what is considered to be the match that gave birth to the modern hardcore style of wrestling. Lawler himself has said that he believes that the birth of hardcore wrestling can be traced back to this match that he was part of in 79. It was Lawler and Bill Dundee against the man who would go on to become Moondog Spot and the man who would go on to become the Honky Tonk Man, Lawler's cousin, in a very famous concession stand brawl. So yes, the Honky Tonk Man helped give rise to hardcore wrestling. Who knew? Who knew that to be true? 2 years later, they did another concession stand brawl, which they had highlights of here on this episode. Only this one was with Onita and Masafuchi against Eddie Gilbert and Ricky Morton. And Onita told the story on Dark Side of a woman during that match kicking him in the face with her high heel shoe. And he started bleeding all over the place. He had this really bad gash. And it was then that he realized that hardcore wrestling really got a rise out of people. And it really, seeing the blood and the violence and the weapons and everything, it really got them excited. It turned them on. And that's something that he never forgot. And eventually he returned to All Japan from his excursion, I guess you would call it, to the States. And again, he was more of a high-flying type, more technical in the ring, but he suffered a freak injury to his knee. And they showed the moment that it happened, and I had never seen this before. He had just won a match, or I think he won. He just finished a match. And all he did as he's kind of posing for the crowd, he's out on the apron. He jumps off the apron, just, jumps off to the ground, and his knee gave out. He popped his kneecap, and it was just all this damage was done. Total freak occurrence, and he could see the bone sticking out from the skin. It was a devastating injury from which he was told there would be no coming back. That's what doctors told him. So what do you do when you're someone who is still, very young and you rely on your athleticism, and now that's been taken away from you? Well, you fall back on the brawling and the blood and the gore and the guts that he learned in the States. And that was the genesis a few years later of FMW. Onita was FMW. He was the founder. He was the top star. With him, it's almost like a cult of personality. You take him away and everything falls apart, which is kind of what happened years later when he retired. But FMW made its reputation off of barbed wire matches and matches with electrical shocks and giant explosions, exploding rings, stuff that nobody else was doing. Nobody else was doing it because it's fucking insane. That's why. Nobody else was crazy enough to even think about stuff like this. They had video and some still images of this one female wrestler who got badly burned in a match in FMW. I think Megumi Kudo, I believe is her name. And she was wrestling her retirement match, which was a no-ropes, barbed wire, double landmine, glass crush death match. Mick Foley said that he was backstage getting ready to go out for his match, and he could hear the moans and the agonizing screams when she got to the back. The fireball that had hit her had burned the fabric of her ring attire into her flesh. Now, if that's the match that he's referring to, I'm not sure if that is the exact match. Probably not, because she wrestled that match in 1997. And Mick Foley wasn't doing no FMW matches in 1997, so he might have been referring to something other than what they were showing us on screen. But that, just to give you an example, that is the type of abuse that people, male or female, routinely went through working for FMW. That was the style. That was the expectation. You keep upping the ante and trying to come up with newer and more unique ideas for how you can, maim yourself or maim your opponent, you're going to get hurt. You don't do matches like that with the expectation that you're going to come out of it unscathed. And the people believed in Onita because he looked like one of them. He wasn't a big bodybuilder. He wasn't a big, tall guy. He looked like them. And they believed that, hey, if this guy can go out there and take that kind of punishment and be a hero and be a top star the way that he was, it's almost like they were living vicariously through him. He would cry and he would cut a promo in the ring at the end of his matches before walking off to the back or to the ambulance, all bloody and scarred up. He was their hero. And by his own admission, he let it all go to his head. He went from being viewed as the underdog to being treated like royalty, making what he claimed was $2 million a year at his peak. That is what he claimed. Driving 5 cars and buying a nice fancy house. And they mentioned his ties to the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. Terry Funk said the Yakuza controlled the arenas. And Jericho says it was basically a giant money laundering scheme. Foley would go out to these dinners with sponsors. A lot of those Bullet Club guys, when they were in New Japan, they would do that all the time when they were working with New Japan. Because I would see, Anderson and Gallows would always post about them being out with sponsors at a dinner somewhere and drinking sake and they're taking pictures. I mean, really, I think a lot of it is wealthy fans, really, is what it is. That's kind of who these sponsors are. But Foley talked about being out at some of these dinners, and a lot of the sponsors were missing their pinky fingers, which had to do with them being in the line of work that they were in. And he wasn't exactly comfortable with it, but what was he going to say? Was he going to say no? Yeah, I think I'm going to hang back at the hotel. I think I'm going to check out early tonight. You went out and you did it on behalf of the company. You went out and you went to these dinners, and these are the kind of people that you hung out with. They talked about the famous exploding barbed wire time bomb match with Terry Funk and Onita, where after Onita wins, he pins Funk. He leaves the ring because the timer, you can see the timer on screen, is counting down to the big explosion. When that countdown runs out, the ring would explode. And Onita is outside, and maybe there's 20 seconds left. And he looks back and he realizes that his mentor, the man that he idolized when he was younger, even before the Tupelo stuff. When Onita first came to the States, they talked about how he came and stayed with Terry Funk and he was on the Double Cross Ranch. He would see when Funk would come over, he and his brother Dory would come to Japan, how over they were. They would do that wild Western style, and it got over in front of the Japanese audience. And a young Onita never forgot that. So he always had this great reverence for Terry Funk, and they knew each other. And again, he came to the States and was with Funk. So here now they have this match, and he pins him and he wins, and he's looking back. Seconds are just ticking down off the timer. And he sees the man that he idolizes about to be blown up. And so Onita dives into the ring with only seconds to spare, and he is valiantly trying to drag Terry out to safety. But he realizes there's not enough time. So instead, in the last 2 seconds, he drapes his body over Terry's. He shields him. And all of these explosions suddenly get set off around the ring. The ultimate babyface move. He sacrificed himself. He jumped on the grenade. The finish of the Jon Moxley-Kenny Omega barbed wire deathmatch at Revolution this year was inspired by that match. That's what they were going for at the end, with Moxley and Eddie Kingston, and obviously it did not work out. But that match was basically, that they did earlier this year, that match was a love letter to the Funk and Onita match in '93. So then Onita announces his retirement in '95, out of nowhere. He's done, he wants to do other things. And they had groomed a young star named Hayabusa to be his successor and carry the company. And Jericho talked about how Hayabusa for years, what an incredible performer he was. He would do these moonsaults, which nobody else was doing. Even though the great Muta was doing moonsaults even back in the 80s. Even fucking Vader was doing moonsaults in the early 90s. But wrestlers love to tell stories, I guess. So with Onita out, Shoichi Arai took control of FMW as its new president. He had been their ring announcer for years. So that was quite the promotion for Mr. Arai. I mean, imagine Lillian Garcia suddenly taking Vince McMahon's job. Can't be any worse, I guess, than some of the stuff we've gotten in recent years. I'd like Lillian to get a shot at the job and see how good she is. But they interviewed Shirai's daughter, Shell, for the episode. I talked about Shirai and his whole sad story in another history segment that I did earlier this year. Things did not go well under his regime, under his leadership of FMW. Crowds dwindled from thousands to a few hundred. He wanted to move away from the deathmatch style and market FMW to a more mainstream audience. It would be as if Vince McMahon took over ECW in its original incarnation. If Vince McMahon would have stepped in 1998 and taken the reins away from Paul Heyman and said, we're going to make this a more sports-oriented, sports entertainment-oriented product. Not even Attitude Era, because Attitude Era was 98. But picture Vince McMahon, the Vince McMahon of 1995, stepping in 98 at peak ECW and saying, we're going to take this in a more mainstream direction with gimmicks and characters and entertainment and fun. I don't think that would have went over very well with the ECW diehards. And that's basically what Shirai tried to do here. They even introduced a championship belt called the World Entertainment Title. And it just died a death. As did Shirai, not long after this. I mean, they had footage of a group of wrestlers on one show. They were crowding around another wrestler on the mat, urinating on him. You had wrestlers sticking firecrackers in each other's asses. They should have brought Russo in to book FMW, but we all know what he thinks of Japanese wrestling. So Onita eventually comes back because, of course, he can't stay away. He probably realized he got over in FMW. He was a huge, massive star in FMW. And outside of FMW, I don't know that maybe he felt he could sustain that level of stardom and fame. So anyway, he comes back to FMW. And he had his own ideas for how to do things, and that just didn't jive with the direction that they were going in. And Onita had a big head. Onita was out for Onita, and they kicked him out. And then in 2001, tragedy struck. One of the worst things that I've ever seen as a wrestling fan. Hayabusa was wrestling Mammoth Sasaki when he went for a springboard moonsault off the middle rope, which is a move that he did commonly in his matches. But he slipped. And he came down at such an angle. Now picture somebody doing a lionsault where they're, twisting their body, and he comes down and he lands on his forehead. And he broke his neck. And he was paralyzed instantly. That was the end of his career. It's still fucking eerie to see footage of that segment, and they didn't show this here, but I've talked about this before as well. There was a segment on that show on that night in October of '01 that they did right before his match with some person. It was in a staircase. There was this guy at the top of the staircase dressed in this cloak and a mask. He was dressed as an evil spirit, warning Hayabusa that his career was about to end soon. And then Hayabusa goes out to the ring and he gets paralyzed. And his career comes to an end. I don't remember what the storyline was or the context. I don't remember all the details about what that was all about. But I'm sorry. That is way too eerie for me. Sabu says he didn't die. Hayabusa didn't die, but what happened to him was worse. He says if it was him, he would rather have died than be paralyzed. It's the reason that I still fear for Chris Jericho every time I see him do the lion salt. Even now when he does it at 50 years old, and he's not the athlete he used to be 10 or 20 years ago, all it takes is one wrong move. One slip. And it could be Hayabusa all over again. So with his top star paralyzed, Arai knew that he was doomed. He had outstanding debts to be paid to the Yakuza. He was borrowing money from his family to try to pay what he could. His wife divorced him. The company declared bankruptcy in 2002. They didn't mention this in the episode, but he went into hiding. And he had started writing a book about running FMW, like a tell-all expose kind of deal, with the idea that it might make enough money to help pay down some of the debt that he owed. And you can find some of those chapters, the unpublished chapters, online if you search for them. What I have read from what Arai wrote is not very kind at all to Onita, and really exposes him and just the way he treated people, or at least that's his version of events. Supposedly, FMW was $3 million in debt. At the time they filed for bankruptcy, they had another $1 million that was said to be owed to the Yakuza. Arai decided that there was no way out. He spoke with Hayabusa on the phone, and he said that he had planned to kill himself so that his now ex-wife and his child would get enough insurance money to pay off the debt. And Hayabusa is pleading with him. He's begging with him not to do it. Don't kill yourself. We'll come up with a better way to get the money. But Arai walked to the park one morning after that, wearing his suit, and he hung himself, I think from a tree, with his necktie. And a jogger found him. His family did end up collecting on his insurance policy, but it still wasn't enough to pay back the Yakuza, and they continued to make payments for years after that, because you knew the Yakuza's not just going to forgive and forget. It's like, oh, well, this guy's not around anymore, I guess we're not going to get paid. As Sabu pointed out in the episode, they're going to get their money. By hook or crook, they're going to get their money somehow. And even though he, in his mind, thought, well, I'll take my own life and my family will get money and they can pay off the debt, it wasn't enough. I like how Onita said, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, and then he proceeded to talk about how Arai was a failure. I'm still here, I survived somehow. He's putting himself over and putting this guy down. They showed footage of the show in 2015, where Hayabusa stood up out of his wheelchair and he actually started walking. Now, he had the assistance of these walkers. He was going very slowly, but he was walking after being told probably that he would never walk again. I mean, that was a very emotional thing. And then less than a year after that, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and he died. And Onita here in the episode gets the last word by saying, Hulk Hogan is Hulk Hogan. Inoki is Inoki, Baba is Baba, and Onita is Onita. There is only one generation, he says, no successor. The man thinks very highly of himself. That's one of the big takeaways from this special. He does think very highly of himself, and I guess you can say for good reason. This man built an entire promotion around himself and achieved massive success for many, many years. Success that he is still playing off of to this very day. He booked himself basically to be the star of his own territory, and a lot of people have done that over the years. Whether it's, you think of the Jarretts, whether you think of Jerry Lawler, I mean, take your pick, right? There's been a lot of territories in this country going back many years where you had that one big star. That star, he may have been the booker. They built everything around him. That's basically what Onita did with FMW. And they didn't cover this but I thought it was timely. Just this year, in 2021, Onita started a new promotion under the FMW name called FMWE, with the E standing for explosion, because of course it would, where they do exploding death matches. He says he got the idea from Kenny Omega and Jon Moxley doing their match at Revolution and seeing that there was still a market and a hunger for matches like that. So the spirit of FMW lives on. They had their debut show in July at a fruit and vegetable market in Japan. Imagine going out to buy some mango and papaya and seeing some dudes get blown to smithereens, right? All in a day, I guess. So that was the FMW episode. Hey, look at that. We got through one of these without Ric Flair having to issue an apology. Next week, it is Bikers, Bombs, and Bedlam. The story of Johnny K9, Bruiser Bedlam, who was once convicted of bombing a police station and was also accused of murder. So that should be another heartwarming episode of Dark Side of the Ring. And I will be back with you to review that as well as we move along here through the remaining episodes of Season 3. So until next time, take care, guys, and I will see you back for more Dark Side content very soon.